Lieutenant Yamada Takeshi crouched in his forward observation post on the northern slope of Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima, watching the American landing force through his binoculars. It was February 19th, 1945, 08:45 hours. The beach below was chaos. Marines were pinned down by machine gun fire from positions his own regiment had helped prepare. Landing craft continued to arrive, disgorging men and equipment onto the black volcanic sand. He had been trained at the Imperial Japanese Army Artillery School in Chiba for 2 years. He knew his craft. He understood the mathematics of indirect fire, the careful calculation of range and deflection, the coordination required between forward observers and gun batteries. His own artillery pieces, Type 91105mm howitzers, were positioned in reinforced concrete bunkers 2 kilometers inland. They were registered on the beaches. The preparations had been meticulous. Colonel Takeshi Nishi himself had overseen the defensive planning. Every approach, every landing zone, every possible avenue of advance had been mapped and pre-plotted. Yamada watched a concentration of Marines gathering near a destroyed landing craft. He reached for his field telephone, cranking the handle 3 times to signal the fire direction center. A voice answered. Yamada gave his report. Enemy infantry, approximately company strength, grid coordinates 874231. Request high explosive barrage. The voice on the other end acknowledged. Yamada waited. He had done this before, in China, in the Philippines. He knew the procedure. The Fire Direction Center would receive his request. An officer would review it, verify the coordinates against their defensive plan, calculate the firing solution. The information would be passed to the battery commander. The battery commander would review it, issue orders to the gun crews. The crews would adjust their pieces, load the shells, prepare to fire. In China, this process had taken perhaps 15 minutes. Against poorly coordinated Chinese forces, 15 minutes was acceptable. Here, against the Americans, Yamada expected it might take 10. The Imperial Army had improved its procedures, streamlined its communications, trained its crews to respond faster. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yamada kept his binoculars trained on the target area. The Marines were moving now, spreading out, establishing fighting positions. He could see officers directing their men, pointing toward inland positions. Equipment was being unloaded. More Marines were arriving. Still, no fire from his own artillery. He glanced at his watch. 5 minutes had passed. He cranked the telephone again. The Fire Direction Center reported they were processing his request. Calculations were being verified. The battery was being notified. Yamada returned to his observation. 8 minutes now. The Marine concentration he had reported was dispersing. They were moving inland, beyond the pre-registered zones. He was preparing to call in a correction when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a sound he had never heard before in combat. Not the whistle of incoming shells, not yet. It was something else. A young Marine, no more than 20 yards from the shoreline, was speaking into a radio handset. Yamada could not hear the words, but he could see the Marine's calm demeanor, the casual way he held the device, the brief exchange. The Marine set down the handset. Yamada checked his watch again. 90 seconds had passed since the Marine had made his call. Then the world exploded. American artillery shells began impacting on the northern slope of Mount Suribachi with devastating accuracy. Not on the beaches where Yamada had called fire. On his own position, the Americans were firing on him. The shells were landing in a pattern that suggested someone had given them his exact coordinates. The barrage was not random harassment fire. It was precise, concentrated, and it had arrived in 90 seconds. To understand Yamada's shock, one must understand what artillery meant to the Imperial Japanese Army and how fundamentally different their doctrine was from their American counterparts. Japanese artillery development in the 1930s was shaped by the Army's experiences in Manchuria and China, conflicts where firepower often took second place to infantry, elan, and close combat. The prevailing military philosophy emphasized the supremacy of the bayonet charge, the importance of seishin, fighting spirit, over material considerations. This was not mere propaganda. It was codified doctrine taught at every level of military education. The Infantry Manual of 1933 stated explicitly that the essence of infantry combat is the decisive assault, executed with indomitable spirit, in which the enemy is destroyed through hand-to-hand combat. Artillery existed to support this assault, not to replace it. This philosophical foundation shaped everything about Japanese artillery organization, training, and employment. The standard Japanese artillery regiment in 1945 consisted of 3 battalions, each with 12 guns. These were typically Type 9-1105 5mm howitzers or Type 3-875 5mm field guns. The weapons themselves were competent designs, mechanically reliable, and reasonably accurate. The Type 91 could fire a 15-kilogram shell to a maximum range of approximately 10,800 meters. Its rate of fire was 6 to 8 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. But artillery is not merely about the guns. It is about the system that employs them. The system includes observation, communication, fire direction, and the doctrine that governs how all these elements work together. In the Japanese artillery system of World War II, observation was handled by forward observers, attached to infantry units. These officers carried field telephones connected by wire to battalion or regimental command posts. The observers were trained to identify targets, estimate ranges, and call for fire support. Their training emphasized patience and deliberation. A proper fire mission required careful observation, precise calculation, and verification through multiple levels of command. Communication relied almost entirely on field telephones. These were simple devices, reliable within their limitations. A sound-powered telephone required no batteries, using the electrical current generated by the voice itself to transmit signals through copper wire. The wires were laid by hand, often under fire, connecting forward positions to command posts to fire direction centers to gun batteries. The system worked, but it was slow and fragile. A single artillery shell could sever a wire, breaking the communication link. Repair teams would have to locate the break, often under continued bombardment, and splice the wire back together. The fire direction process itself reflected Japanese military culture. When a forward observer called for fire, his request went to the battalion fire direction center. Here, officers would review the request, verify it against tactical plans, calculate the firing data. Range and deflection had to be determined using manual calculations, slide rules, and firing tables. The solution would be checked by a senior officer before being transmitted to the battery. At the battery commander would receive the fire mission, verify the data again, and issue orders to individual gun crews. Each gun crew would adjust their piece according to the firing data, load the appropriate ammunition, and prepare to fire. Only when all guns were ready, and only after the battery commander had personally verified that each piece was properly laid, would the order to fire be given. This process was thorough. It was careful. It minimized errors and friendly fire incidents. It reflected the Japanese emphasis on hierarchy, on verification through proper channels, on the responsibility of officers to personally ensure correct execution of orders. It was also devastatingly slow. From the moment a forward observer identified a target to the moment shells left the tubes, 10 to 15 minutes would typically elapse. In fluid combat situations, this meant targets disappeared before fire could arrive. The United States Marine Corps had developed an entirely different philosophy of artillery employment, one born from harsh lessons learned in World War I and refined through 2 decades of institutional study. Marine artillery doctrine in 1945 represented perhaps the most advanced fire support system fielded by any military force in human history. It was built on 3 revolutionary concepts: speed, flexibility, and the radical decentralization of authority to the lowest capable level. The foundation of this system was the forward observer, but not as the Japanese understood the role. Marine forward observers were not mere spotters who reported targets and waited for someone else to make decisions. They were certified fire direction officers, trained to calculate firing data, authorized to call for and adjust fire missions without approval from higher headquarters. A Marine forward observer carried more than binoculars and a telephone. He carried a map, a compass, a plotting board, range cards for every artillery battery in range of his position, and most importantly, a radio. The radio was typically an SCR 300 or SCR 610 set, capable of transmitting voice communications over distances of 5 to 10 kilometers depending on terrain. The forward observer's training was extensive and practical. He learned to read maps with precision, to estimate ranges using multiple methods, to calculate firing data using abbreviated methods that sacrificed marginal accuracy for speed. He learned to recognize different types of targets and to know instinctively which type of ammunition and which pattern of fire would be most effective. He learned to adjust fire, walking rounds onto a target through successive corrections, bringing devastating accuracy to bear in minimum time. Most critically, he learned that he had the authority to initiate fire missions on his own judgment. Behind the forward observer stood the Fire Direction Center, but again, not as the Japanese practiced it. American fire direction centers were organized for speed and volume. Instead of deliberate calculation and verification through hierarchical review, American procedures emphasized rapid plotting, mechanical computation, and immediate transmission of firing data. When a forward observer called for fire, the Fire Direction Center received his transmission directly via radio. A plotting sergeant would immediately mark the target location on a map. A computer, not an electronic device, but a soldier trained in ballistic calculations, would use mechanical plotting boards and firing tables to determine the range and deflection. These calculations took seconds, not minutes. The firing data would be transmitted immediately to the batteries. No verification by senior officers, no approval required from battalion command. The fire direction officer, typically a lieutenant or captain, had full authority to approve fire missions based on his professional judgment. If the target was legitimate and the data was correct, the mission went forward immediately. The batteries themselves were organized for rapid response. Marine artillery crews in the Pacific War were trained to a standard that seems almost impossible by the standards of other armies. A 75mm pack howitzer crew could receive a fire mission, lay the gun, load, and fire the first round in under 30 seconds. A 105mm howitzer battery could achieve first-round impact within 90 seconds of receiving the initial call for fire. This was not theoretical. This was the documented, verified standard achieved by Marine artillery units throughout the Pacific Campaign. The speed was achieved through brutal, repetitive training and through equipment designed specifically for rapid employment. The 105mm M2A1 howitzer, the standard Marine artillery piece in 1945, could traverse its barrel 35 degrees left or right without moving the trail. It had a screw-type elevation mechanism that allowed precise adjustment. The sights were clear and easy to read. Ammunition was pre-positioned near each gun in protected dumps, organized by type and readily accessible. The system that delivered artillery fire in 90 seconds was not the product of individual brilliance or improvisation. It was the result of institutional development that began in the 1920s when the Marine Corps established its Field Artillery School at Quantico, Virginia. The school's mission was to develop doctrine and train officers specifically for amphibious warfare, a form of combat that presented unique challenges for artillery employment. Traditional artillery doctrine assumed guns would be positioned on stable terrain, with established supply lines and fixed communications. Amphibious assault shattered all these assumptions. Guns had to be landed on hostile beaches, often under fire. They had to be brought into action quickly, before the infantry assault lost momentum. They had to provide fire support during the most vulnerable phase of any operation, when assault forces were establishing their beachhead and enemy counterattacks were most dangerous. Speed was not merely desirable, it was absolutely essential to survival. Marine artillery officers studied the problem methodically. They analyzed World War I operations where delayed artillery support had resulted in failed assaults and catastrophic casualties. They conducted experiments at Quantico and at exercises in the Caribbean, testing different procedures, measuring response times, identifying bottlenecks in the fire direction process. By 1933, they had developed a standardized system built around the concept of the forward observer as an independent fire direction officer. The training program for Marine artillery forward observers was 6 months long, far more extensive than equivalent training in the Army or in any foreign military. Students learned map reading to a standard where they could identify their position within 10 meters using terrain association and compass bearings. They learned to estimate ranges using multiple techniques, bracketing with binoculars marked with mil scales, using known reference points, even estimating based on the time delay between muzzle flash and sound of impact. They learned the ballistics of every weapon in the Marine Corps inventory. A forward observer had to know that a 75mm pack howitzer firing charge 3 had a muzzle velocity of 390 meters per second and a maximum range of 8,700 meters. He had to know that a 105mm M2, a 1 firing charge, 7, could reach 11,200 meters. He had to know the trajectory characteristics, the beaten zone patterns, the types of fuses available and when to use each one. They learned abbreviated fire direction procedures that allowed them to calculate firing data in the field using simplified methods. A trained observer could determine the range and deflection to a target, factor in basic meteorological data, and produce firing data accurate enough for effective fire within 2 minutes, using nothing more than a map, a compass, and a simple plotting board. Most importantly, they learned radio procedure. Marine Corps radio discipline was legendary for its clarity and efficiency. Every call for fire followed the same format, transmitted in the same sequence, using the same terminology. The observer would identify himself by call sign, identify the target type, give coordinates using the military grid system, request the type of fire mission. A typical transmission might last 15 seconds. Bulldog 3, this is Watchdog 2, fire mission, over. Infantry in the open, grid 5, 9, 7, 3, 2, 4. Request high explosive, will adjust, over. The Fire Direction Center would acknowledge, Watchdog 2, this is Bulldog 3, roger, shot, over. Shot meant the rounds were on the way. The entire exchange, from initial call to rounds impacting, took 90 seconds. This was not an exceptional performance. This was the standard. Marine artillery units that could not meet this standard were considered deficient and required additional training. The emphasis on speed extended to every element of the system. Fire direction centers used plotting boards designed for rapid target location. The M17 plotting board, standard equipment in Marine artillery battalions by 1944, allowed a plotting sergeant to mark a target's position and measure range and deflection in less than 10 seconds. Firing data calculation used mechanical devices that simplified the mathematics. The M1 graphical firing table, a circular slide rule specifically designed for artillery calculations, could produce firing data for a 105mm howitzer in approximately 20 seconds. These devices were not as precise as full mathematical calculations, but they were accurate enough for combat purposes, and they were fast. Battery commanders were trained to trust their crews and their procedures. When firing data arrived from the Fire Direction Center, gun crews executed immediately. There was no secondary verification, no approval required from the battery commander before firing. The crews had been trained to standard, they knew their jobs, the system assumed competence and demanded speed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The guns themselves were positioned for rapid engagement. Marine artillery doctrine called for batteries to be emplaced in positions that allowed all-around traverse, giving them the ability to engage targets in any direction without moving the trail. Ammunition was organized by type and stored in protected positions immediately adjacent to each gun. A well-trained crew could transition from one type of ammunition to another, from high explosive to white phosphorus to illumination, within a single fire mission without significant delay. Lieutenant Yamada survived the American counter-battery fire that had targeted his observation post, but the experience shook him profoundly. He had called for fire on American positions and received no response from his own artillery. An American observer, somewhere on that chaotic beach, had called for fire on his position and received an immediate, devastating response. The implications were almost too large to process. He withdrew from his forward position as American Marines began pushing inland, moving back through the defensive network toward the command bunker where Colonel Nishi maintained his headquarters. The battle for Iwo Jima unfolded over the following days and weeks as a revelation of the disparity between Japanese and American fire support capabilities. Japanese artillery positions, carefully prepared and camouflaged over months of work, were systematically destroyed by American counter-battery fire. The pattern was consistent and terrifying to Japanese observers. A Japanese gun would fire on American positions. Within minutes, sometimes within seconds, American artillery would respond, landing shells on or near the Japanese position with uncanny accuracy. The Americans were using a technique the Japanese had not encountered before: flash and sound ranging. Specialized marine observation teams, equipped with surveying instruments and sound detection equipment, could locate enemy artillery by the flash of their guns and the sound of their firing. The data would be transmitted immediately to fire direction centers. Counter-battery missions would be calculated and executed while the Japanese guns were still being reloaded for their second shot. On February 21st, 2 days after the initial landing, a Japanese artillery battery positioned in a reinforced bunker on the island's northern plateau fired a devastating barrage on marine positions near Airfield No. 1. The battery consisted of 4 Type 9 1105mm howitzers, well protected, carefully positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire while remaining hidden from aerial observation. The guns fired 12 rounds each, a total of 48 shells landing among marine positions within 3 minutes. It was effective fire, causing casualties and forcing Marines to take cover. The battery commander, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, was satisfied with the mission. His crews had performed well. The guns were already being prepared for displacement to alternate positions, standard procedure to avoid counter-battery fire. Before the displacement could begin, American shells began impacting on and around the bunker. The volume of fire was staggering. It was not a single battery responding. It was multiple batteries firing a coordinated time on target mission, where shells from different guns at different locations were calculated to impact simultaneously, giving the target no warning and no opportunity to take cover. Captain Tanaka counted at least 60 impacts within the first minute. His bunker, designed to withstand naval gunfire, held against the initial barrage, but the continued pounding was devastating. Communications wires were severed. One gun took a direct hit through its firing aperture, killing the crew and destroying the piece. Another gun was disabled when repeated near misses collapsed part of the bunker's roof structure. The barrage continued for 8 minutes. When it ended, Tanaka's battery was no longer combat effective. 2 guns were destroyed, 1 was damaged beyond field repair, and only 1 remained operational. More than half his crews were casualties. The response time had been less than 4 minutes from the moment Tanaka's guns had fired to the moment American shells began landing. Tanaka knew from his training that this should have been impossible. The Americans could not possibly have observed his position, calculated firing data, transmitted orders to multiple batteries, and executed a coordinated fire mission in 4 minutes. It was not possible, according to everything he had been taught about artillery procedures. Yet, it had happened. Across Iwo Jima, the same pattern repeated. Japanese artillery that revealed its position by firing was immediately subjected to counter-battery fire of overwhelming volume and accuracy. Japanese forward observers who called for fire on American positions found their requests delayed or ignored as fire direction centers struggled to process missions while simultaneously dealing with American counter-battery fire and the general breakdown of communications under sustained bombardment. Private First Class Robert Henderson was a forward observer with the 1st Battalion, 13th Marines, the artillery regiment supporting the 5th Marine Division on Iwo Jima. He was 22 years old, from a small town in Nebraska, and he had been trained in artillery procedures at Camp Pendleton in California. On February 23, 1945, Henderson was attached to a rifle company pushing north from the initial landing beaches toward the base of Mount Suribachi. The terrain was volcanic ash and rock, offering minimal cover. Japanese positions were dug into the hillside, mutually supporting, nearly invisible, until they opened fire. The rifle company came under fire from a complex of bunkers and fighting positions on the lower slopes of Suribachi. Machine guns, rifles, and at least one anti-tank gun were engaging the Marines, pinning them down in the open. Henderson moved forward to a position where he could observe the enemy positions. He carried his SCR 610 radio, his map, his binoculars, and his plotting board. He identified 3 distinct enemy positions. The largest appeared to be a reinforced bunker with multiple firing ports. He estimated the range at 800 meters, marked the location on his map, and determined the grid coordinates. Henderson keyed his radio handset. Seahorse 6, this is Checkmate 2, fire mission, over. The response came immediately. Checkmate 2, this is Seahorse 6, send it, over. Henderson transmitted his fire request using the standard format, speaking clearly despite the machine gun fire impacting near his position. Bunker with infantry, grid 543 278. Request high explosive. Will adjust. Over. He checked his watch as he transmitted. 0943 hours. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged. Checkmate. 2. Shot. Over. Henderson waited, binoculars trained on the target area. He counted the seconds. At 78 seconds after his initial transmission, he heard the distinctive sound of 105mm shells passing overhead. The first rounds impacted approximately 50 meters beyond the target. Henderson transmitted his adjustment. Add 5 to 0, left 2 to 0, over. The correction meant the next rounds should be 50 meters closer and 20 meters to the left. The Fire Direction Center rogered his transmission. 30 seconds later, the adjustment rounds impacted. They were close, landing within 10 meters of the bunker. Henderson called, fire for effect, over. Fire for effect meant stop adjusting and fire multiple rounds for maximum destructive effect. All 4 guns in the battery fired 3 rounds each, 12 shells impacting on and around the target bunker within 20 seconds. The bunker's firing ceased. Henderson observed through his binoculars and saw secondary explosions, likely ammunition cooking off inside the position. From his initial call for fire to the destruction of the target, 2 minutes and 40 seconds had elapsed. The rifle company resumed its advance. Henderson would call for and adjust 17 fire missions that day. His experience was not unusual. Every Marine rifle company had attached forward observers. Every observer had the authority to call for fire. Every Fire Direction Center was prepared to respond immediately. The system worked under the most severe stress imaginable, under fire, in difficult terrain, with inexperienced personnel and equipment that had been soaked in salt water during the landing. Japanese observers watching the American advance saw something that contradicted everything they understood about artillery employment. They saw American infantry advancing with what appeared to be personal artillery support, able to call down devastating fire missions within minutes, sometimes within seconds, of encountering resistance. They saw American artillery firing hundreds, sometimes thousands of rounds per day, volumes of fire that Japanese batteries could not sustain for even a few hours due to limited ammunition stocks. They saw American fire direction that was not centralized at regiment or division level, but distributed down to battalion level, sometimes even to battery level, allowing multiple simultaneous fire missions to be executed without coordination delays. They saw a system that appeared to violate every principle of proper artillery employment, as taught in Japanese military schools, and yet it worked with terrifying effectiveness. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was crushing. Artillery had always been the great equalizer in infantry combat, the weapon that allowed defenders to break up attacks before they reached the defensive line. But American artillery responded faster than Japanese defenders could adjust to changing circumstances. By the time a Japanese observer's fire mission was processed and executed, the American forces he had been targeting had already moved, and his own position was being subjected to counter-battery fire. The speed of American artillery response was only part of the story. The other part, equally devastating to Japanese defenders, was the sheer volume of fire that American batteries could sustain. This was not a matter of doctrine or training. This was a matter of industrial capacity and logistics, the unglamorous but absolutely critical foundation of modern warfare. A Marine 105mm howitzer battery on Iwo Jima consisted of 4 guns. Each gun could fire a maximum of 10 rounds per minute under sustained fire conditions, though typical fire missions involved slower rates to preserve barrel life and allow for adjustments. A single battery firing at moderate rates could deliver 40 rounds per minute on target. The 5th Marine Division Artillery, supporting the assault on Iwo Jima, included 4 battalions of 105mm howitzers, a total of 48 guns. When concentrated on a single target, these batteries could deliver nearly 2,000 rounds in the first 5 minutes of a fire mission. The ammunition to sustain this rate of fire had to come from somewhere. It came from a logistics system that was unprecedented in its scale and efficiency. Each 105mm high-explosive shell weighed 33 pounds. The complete round, including propellant charge and packing, weighed approximately 42 pounds. A single howitzer firing 100 rounds per day, a modest rate by Iwo Jima standards, required 2 tons of ammunition. 48 howitzers firing at that rate required 96 tons of ammunition per day. The ammunition was manufactured in the United States at government arsenals and private contractors. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri, which had begun operations in 1941, could produce 100,000 artillery shells per month at peak capacity. Badger Army Ammunition Plant in Wisconsin produced similar quantities. These facilities operated around the clock, employing tens of thousands of workers, many of them women who had entered the workforce specifically to support war production. The completed ammunition was shipped from factories to ports on the east and west coasts. At ports, it was loaded onto ammunition ships, specially designed vessels with extensive safety features to reduce the risk of accidental detonation. The ships crossed the Pacific, a journey of several weeks, to forward supply bases at Pearl Harbor, Eniwetok, and Ulithi Atoll. At these bases, the ammunition was sorted, inspected, and prepared for final delivery to combat units. For the Iwo Jima operation, ammunition ships accompanied the invasion fleet, arriving off the island on the day of the assault. The ammunition was transferred to landing craft and brought directly to the beaches, where Marine shore parties organized it into ammunition dumps. From the dumps, working parties carried shells forward to the gun positions, maintaining a constant supply even as the batteries fired continuously. The entire system, from factory floor in Missouri to gun position on Iwo Jima, took approximately 6 weeks. But once established, it could sustain rates of fire that simply had no equivalent in Japanese military capability. Japanese artillery on Iwo Jima faced completely different constraints. The island had been garrisoned and fortified for months before the American invasion. Ammunition had been stockpiled in underground magazines, carefully protected from air attack and naval bombardment. But the quantities were limited by what could be transported to the island and stored in the available space. A typical Japanese artillery battery on Iwo Jima had perhaps 500 rounds per gun in immediate storage, with additional stocks held in central magazines under regimental control. 500 rounds sounds substantial until one calculates the expenditure rate. At 10 rounds per gun per hour, a modest rate during active combat, a 4-gun battery would exhaust its basic load in 12.5 hours of firing. Resupply from central magazines required physical transportation of shells from storage bunkers to gun positions, often under American artillery fire and air attack. Working parties had to move shells by hand, carrying them through trenches and tunnels, a process that was slow, dangerous, and increasingly impossible as American forces tightened their control of the island. Japanese artillery commanders on Iwo Jima faced an impossible choice. They could fire their guns freely in response to every target of opportunity, providing maximum support to the infantry defenders, but exhausting their ammunition within days. Or they could husband their ammunition, firing only at critical targets, preserving combat power for the later stages of the battle but leaving infantry without support during the initial American assault. Most chose the second option, rationing ammunition carefully, prioritizing targets, denying fire missions that in any other circumstances would have been approved immediately. The result was that Japanese forward observers, even when they could get through on surviving telephone lines, even when their fire missions were calculated and approved, often received responses that no ammunition was available or that the requested mission was denied due to supply constraints. By the 10th day of the battle for Iwo Jima, Japanese artillery doctrine had collapsed entirely. The careful procedures, the hierarchical verification, the deliberate fire direction process, all of it had become irrelevant. Most of the telephone lines connecting observation posts to fire direction centers had been severed by American bombardment and could not be repaired. The fire direction centers themselves were under constant attack, forcing personnel to abandon systematic calculation in favor of survival. Battery positions that revealed themselves by firing were immediately subjected to counter-battery fire so intense that displacement to alternate positions became suicidal. Gun crews that attempted to move their pieces in daylight were engaged by American aircraft, tanks, and artillery simultaneously. The few guns that remained operational were reduced to firing single rounds at irregular intervals, hoping to avoid detection, knowing that any sustained fire mission would bring immediate and overwhelming response. Japanese artillery officers began to understand that they were not merely outmatched tactically, they were participating in a form of warfare for which their entire military education had not prepared them. The American system did not rely on individual excellence or exceptional courage. It relied on industrial capacity, on logistics, on the systematic application of material superiority. A Marine forward observer did not need to be brilliant. He needed to follow standardized procedures that had been refined through years of institutional development. A Marine Fire Direction Center did not need exceptional officers. It needed competent personnel executing proven methods using purpose-designed equipment. A Marine artillery battery did not need heroic sacrifice from its crews. It needed reliable guns, adequate ammunition, and the training to employ both effectively. The Japanese system, by contrast, had been built around assumptions of scarcity. Scarcity of ammunition required careful rationing and deliberate approval of fire missions. Scarcity of radios required reliance on wire communications and visual signals. Scarcity of trained personnel required centralized control and hierarchical verification to prevent mistakes. These assumptions had been reasonable when fighting Chinese forces in Manchuria, where Japanese industrial and technological superiority had been absolute. They were catastrophic when fighting American forces in the Pacific, where every assumption of scarcity was inverted. Lieutenant Yamada, still alive on March 2, 1945, had been pulled back from forward observation duties. There were no forward observation posts left to man. The telephone network had ceased to exist. His regiment's artillery had been reduced to 3 operational guns from an original complement of 36. These guns fired perhaps a dozen rounds per day, total, coordinated by runners carrying written messages because no other form of communication remained functional. Yamada spent his days in an underground bunker, listening to the sounds of American artillery fire that never seemed to stop. At night, he could hear the diesel generators running on the American ships offshore, powering the lights that turned the invasion beaches into bright staging areas where equipment and supplies were unloaded around the clock. He had been taught that Japanese soldiers possessed spiritual superiority that would overcome material disadvantages. He had believed that superior training and fighting spirit would compensate for inferior numbers or equipment. Iwo Jima had taught him the truth. Spirit could not defeat a shell that arrived in 90 seconds. Training could not overcome an ammunition supply that was effectively unlimited. Fighting to the death, which he and every man on the island had sworn to do, would change nothing about the outcome. The battle for Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945, 36 days after the initial landing. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 1,083 were captured. most of them so badly wounded they could not continue fighting. The rest died in their positions, in the tunnels, in final banzai charges that achieved nothing except to add more bodies to the count. Lieutenant Yamada was not among the survivors. He died on March 21st during an American assault on the bunker complex where he had taken shelter. The bunker was subjected to a preliminary artillery barrage, then attacked by Marines with flamethrowers and demolition charges. There was no possibility of resistance, no chance of meaningful defense. The artillery had destroyed the bunker's structural integrity, the flamethrowers had made the interior uninhabitable, the demolition charges had sealed the entrances. Yamada and the men with him simply ceased to exist. The lessons of Iwo Jima regarding artillery were documented in after-action reports compiled by Marine Corps officers in the months following the battle. These reports noted the effectiveness of the forward observer system, the speed of fire direction procedures, the volume of ammunition expended, and the impact on Japanese defensive capabilities. Total artillery ammunition expenditure for the Iwo Jima operation exceeded 450,000 rounds of all calibers. The 5th Marine Division Artillery alone fired more than 200,000 rounds from its 75mm and 105mm howitzers. This represented approximately 4,200 rounds per gun over 36 days, an average of 116 rounds per gun per day. Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, by comparison, fired an estimated 30,000 artillery rounds during the entire battle, constrained by limited stockpiles and the systematic destruction of their guns by American counter-battery fire. The disparity was 15-1 in volume of fire. When combined with the disparity in response time, the advantage became overwhelming. American Marines could call for artillery support and receive it in minutes. Japanese defenders could call for artillery support and receive nothing, or receive it so late that the tactical situation had changed completely. The psychological impact of this disparity extended far beyond Iwo Jima. Japanese forces on Okinawa, preparing for the inevitable American invasion, studied the reports from Iwo Jima with growing dread. They recognized that the same pattern would repeat. American artillery would respond faster, fire more rounds, and sustain higher rates of fire than Japanese guns could match. The defensive plans for Okinawa reflected this understanding. Japanese artillery was positioned in deep caves and bunkers, protected from counter-battery fire, but also limited in its ability to provide responsive fire support. The guns were used sparingly, firing brief missions before being withdrawn into protected positions. The doctrine had shifted from providing continuous fire support to preserving artillery forces for as long as possible, accepting that responsive fire support was no longer achievable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Even this modified doctrine could not overcome the fundamental disparity in capabilities. When American forces landed on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, they brought with them an artillery force that dwarfed anything previously seen in the Pacific. The 10th Army Artillery included over 600 tubes of various calibers, supported by a logistics system that could deliver thousands of tons of ammunition to the beaches daily. Japanese artillery on Okinawa, despite months of preparation and stockpiling, was systematically destroyed over the 82 days of the campaign. The pattern established at Iwo Jima repeated with depressing consistency. American forward observers called for fire and received immediate response. Japanese observers called for fire and received nothing, or received fire too late to matter. The story of Japanese artillery in the Pacific War is ultimately a story about the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare. The Japanese approach emphasized spiritual factors, careful procedures, hierarchical control, and acceptance of material scarcity as a constraint to be worked around through superior spirit and training. The American approach emphasized systematic development of doctrine, institutional training, technological solutions to tactical problems, and the application of overwhelming material superiority. In the specific case of artillery, this collision produced a disparity so profound that it fundamentally shaped the course of every major battle. The ability to call artillery fire in 90 seconds versus 10 to 15 minutes was not merely a tactical advantage. It was the difference between responsive fire support that could save infantry under attack and fire support that arrived too late to matter. The ability to fire thousands of rounds per day versus hundreds of rounds per day was not merely a quantitative difference. It represented completely different concepts of what artillery could accomplish. For the Japanese soldiers who experienced this disparity firsthand, the realization was devastating. Everything they had been taught about warfare, about the supremacy of spirit over material, about Japanese military superiority, was revealed as fiction. The Americans did not win through superior courage or better training or greater willingness to die for their cause. They won through radios, through plotting boards, through ammunition ships, through factories in Missouri and Wisconsin producing shells by the hundreds of thousands. They won through a system that treated artillery not as a scarce resource to be carefully rationed, but as an abundant tool to be employed freely whenever needed. They won, in the end, because they had built a military force appropriate to industrial warfare in the 20th century, while Japan had built a military force still operating under assumptions that belonged to an earlier era. The 90 seconds that separated an American artillery response from a Japanese artillery response represented more than a gap in procedures. It represented the distance between two different worlds, two different futures, and ultimately, two different destinies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.